Good morning, everybody. Once the battles at Lexington and Concord were finished, it became clear to the Patriots that an army was needed, not just state militia. And then they needed somebody to be in charge of that army. Well, it was on this date, July 3 in 1775, that George Washington took command of the Continental Army in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The Boston Massacre happened in March of 1770, and the fighting at Lexington and Concord is in 1775. So 5 years of tension. Another example of tension was in June of 1772. The British customs schooner Gaspee was burned in Narragansett Bay, south of Providence, by some Rhode Island men. They did put the crew and captain on shore first, but a real sign of tension. In March of 1773, the House of Burgesses in Virginia, here's Williamsburg, set up a committee of correspondence like had been set up in Massachusetts. So the colonies are being more intentional with communicating with each other. So when the Tea Act was passed by Parliament, the goal was to help out the East India Company, and the thing was that Americans could only buy tea from assigned agents of the East India Company. There was a little tax on tea also, but that was the thing that really ticked off the colonists, was their own tea merchants are now cut out of the business. And 4 ports were really targeted by England: Boston, New York, Philly, and Charleston. So the Tea Act affected colonial America from north to south. It wasn't just one area was affected. The people of Charleston were so ticked off that they made these designated agents of the East India Company resign in December of 1773. So there was no tea revenue coming from Charleston. And a few days later, up in Boston, the Boston Tea Party happened. So you've got Charleston and Boston, very intense reaction to the Tea Act. So Parliament responded with the coercive acts. They're also known as the Intolerable Acts. They basically shut down the port of Boston. They took away some local political power. The Quartering Act meant that citizens had to house soldiers. And people were really mad about that. And that led to, a few months later, the first meeting of the Continental Congress. So I think there's a direct link between resistance to the Tea Act and the first meeting of the Continental Congress in Philadelphia in 1774. In 1775, in the spring, Patrick Henry gave his "Give me liberty or give me death" speech. So people are talking about death and combat in normal discourse. And sure enough, in April, Lexington and Concord happened. So Lexington is first, 70 militiamen up against about hundreds of redcoats. Our guys have to retreat. The redcoats go 6 more miles to Concord, and then they meet more militia at the North Bridge, and there's the fight and the terrible retreat for England. So at the end of the day, colonial Americans are feeling pretty good. But the question is, can militia take on trained professionals? And here I am with my friend Ed at the Minuteman statue at the Concord Bridge. But the Continental Congress said, we need a pro and we need a standing army. So they assigned George Washington, pictured here in his red coat from 20 years before. They assigned George the task of commander-in-chief of a standing army in colonial America. That was unheard of. A couple days after that was the Battle of Bunker Hill, where the Brits win, but at a big cost. Washington was not here. He was down in Philadelphia. He took off for the north, and 12 days later arrived in the Boston area. And here's our event. July 3, 1775, Washington took command of the Continental Army in Cambridge, right across the river from Boston. So when you visit Boston next and you go out to Harvard Yard, cross the street and go to the Cambridge Common, where you can see this marker where George Washington took command of a standing army in colonial America.